In the final weeks of 1944, the Western Front settled into a tense and uneven quiet. Snow accumulated along the forests and rolling hills of the Ardennes, muffling the intermittent exchange of artillery fire and obscuring the lines where German and Allied forces watched one another from shattered tree lines and frozen ridges. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin after months of retreat from France, occupied a defensive posture that reflected the strain of sustained losses, logistical depletion, and diminishing operational flexibility. Units newly assembled or hastily reconstituted held positions alongside veteran formations, whose ranks had been reduced far below paper strength. Despite these conditions, senior German commanders observed that the front maintained enough cohesion to resist immediate collapse, largely because the terrain favored experienced defenders and limited large-scale Allied maneuver. Along the length of the Eifel and Ardennes region, the German command recognized an unusual feature in the Allied disposition: a sector comparatively quiet, manned by American divisions recovering from previous operations or newly introduced to the front. Terrain density, limited road networks, and winter weather reduced operational tempo, creating a sector regarded by Allied planners as suitable for rest, acclimatization, and rotation. German staff analyses noted these patterns and reported that the Ardennes remained lightly monitored, with minimal expectation of a rapid German counteraction. Intelligence summaries suggested that Allied command believed German forces lacked the fuel, vehicles, manpower, and air support to mount a large offensive during the winter months. Within the German High Command, this assumption did not go unnoticed. Field reports from corps and division-level staff reflected steadily worsening conditions. Ammunition expenditures had exceeded resupply for weeks. Armored vehicles required repairs that could not be sustained, and winter clothing remained insufficient in many formations. Yet, despite the material strain, morale in some units remained anchored by the belief that the war's trajectory was not yet irrevocably sealed. On the Eastern Front, the situation fluctuated between defensive improvisation and full retreat. On the Western Front, the German leadership perceived an opportunity in the Allies' broad front strategy, which distributed forces across an extended operational area with limited depth in certain sectors. By early December, German reconnaissance patrols reported consistent patterns in American activity. Routine patrols, limited artillery probing, and logistic movements reflecting a belief in a stabilized winter line. Road congestion remained moderate, with bridges and junctions guarded but not heavily fortified. These patterns were compared against larger strategic assessments indicating that Allied attention had shifted toward supply consolidation, forward depot construction, and planning for future offensives aimed at the Rhine. German analysts determined that any major Allied advance would require more extensive preparation and would not begin until early 1945. The German command also observed the changing weather with interest. Heavy cloud cover, persistent fog, and intermittent snowfall restricted aerial reconnaissance and hampered the operational effectiveness of Allied air superiority. This presented an atmospheric window in which German ground forces might maneuver with reduced exposure to Allied air attack. Meteorological units attached to German Army Group B delivered forecasts predicting several days of poor flying conditions in mid-December, potentially offering rare concealment for a large troop movement. Against this backdrop, the German leadership confronted increasingly urgent logistical assessments. Fuel stocks had dropped to critical reserves, forcing prioritization among armored divisions and limiting routine training or repositioning. Ammunition reports warned of shortages that would restrict sustained engagements. Vehicle maintenance units struggled to keep aging equipment functional, often cannibalizing parts from disabled vehicles. Supply networks across the Eifel region relied on limited rail lines vulnerable to Allied bombardment, and road transport was hindered by winter conditions. Yet the potential for a concentrated, short-duration offensive remained under discussion, supported by the argument that a decisive local victory might delay Allied progress and influence diplomatic calculations. In many field commands, officers interpreted the quiet along the front not as a sign of stability, but as a prelude to greater uncertainty. The German army had experienced similar periods earlier in the war, where operational calm masked shifting strategic intentions. However, by late 1944, the ability to respond to Allied initiatives had diminished to the point where defensive reaction alone appeared insufficient. Senior commanders debated whether holding the current line would merely postpone inevitable defeat without altering strategic direction. These arguments circulated upward through staff channels and intersected with the considerations of the highest leadership. As preparations continued for the winter months, German engineering units fortified positions, laid mines, repaired defensive obstacles, and constructed additional shelters. Observation posts monitored American activity, noting that replacement units frequently moved into the region with limited combat experience. American supply dumps appeared to expand, reflecting preparations for winter, but also reinforcing the perception of an army not anticipating immediate combat. German staff journals recorded these interpretations with caution, recognizing that Allied forces remained superior in numbers, materiel, and logistical capacity, even in a secondary sector. Late autumn rains turned roads into mud before temperatures dropped further, forming frozen ruts along key forest routes. German commanders studied these conditions carefully. While movement would be difficult for armored forces, tracked vehicles could still operate along hardened paths, and infantry familiar with forest terrain could advance under cover. Past experience in winter operations informed assessments of where units could be assembled without drawing Allied attention. Troop movements were increasingly conducted at night, with strict radio discipline intended to reduce the risk of Allied intelligence interception. Despite the adverse conditions, the German High Command evaluated the Ardennes sector as offering the best chance to create a sudden operational rupture. The landscape provided natural concealment, the enemy disposition invited risk, and Allied air power might be temporarily negated by winter weather. Field reports continued to reinforce the narrative that the Americans remained focused on consolidation rather than preparation for a large-scale defensive response. As December approached, the strain on German forces remained evident. Divisions were restructured, battalions merged, and equipment shortages documented in meticulous detail. Nevertheless, the front held. The combination of determined leadership, defensive terrain, and the resilience of experienced units created a narrow but tangible margin of operational capability. This margin, though fragile, shaped the German perception that a bold initiative could reverse the momentum of the war on the Western Front, at least temporarily. The tension in the Ardennes deepened as the region settled into the coldest weeks of the year. Snow layered over artillery positions, infantry outposts, and forest tracks. Visibility shifted unpredictably between brief clarity and heavy fog, complicating reconnaissance on both sides. Quiet moments along the line alternated with sudden exchanges of fire, often triggered by patrol encounters or misinterpreted movement in the woods. These details formed the backdrop against which German strategic planners reconsidered the wider war. The winter quiet concealed both exhaustion and anticipation, setting the stage for a decision that would attempt to reshape the direction of the conflict at a moment when Germany's resources were approaching their limits. The origins of the Ardennes Offensive lay in a convergence of strategic pressure, political expectation, and deteriorating military conditions confronting Germany in the second half of 1944. By the time Allied forces liberated Paris in August and advanced toward the German frontier in September, the German leadership faced a rapidly shrinking margin for maneuver. The Wehrmacht's ability to sustain prolonged defensive operations was in question, not only due to battlefield losses, but also because the industrial base supplying those forces was under mounting strain from persistent Allied air attacks. Oil production had been severely disrupted, transportation networks suffered repeated damage, and the reconstitution of armored units unfolded far slower than operational requirements demanded. Within this environment, discussions emerged among senior German commanders regarding potential measures that might alter the trajectory of the war. Some advocated concentrating remaining resources for a defensive line along the Rhine, arguing that geography and interior communications offered the best chance to delay the Allies. Others warned that a purely defensive strategy would erode German capacity over time, without offering any possibility of reversing Allied momentum. These debates circulated through command channels, shaped by varying assessments of morale, supply conditions, and the evolving situation on the Eastern Front. It was against this backdrop that the German High Command began to consider a counteroffensive in the West. Early conceptual proposals reflected a search for an operational opportunity rather than a fully developed plan. Staff officers reviewed the Western Front's extended length, and noted sectors where Allied forces appeared thinly distributed. Additional consideration was given to the terrain's potential to mask German preparations. These preliminary assessments did not yet specify the Ardennes as the focal point, but they highlighted the requirement for any counteroffensive to rely on surprise and concentrated force. The involvement of the highest political leadership shaped the concept from an early stage. Communications from the Führer's headquarters emphasized the necessity of a decisive action, capable of producing a strategic effect. The leadership regarded the Western Allies as less ideologically driven than the Soviet Union, and therefore more susceptible to political disruption. It was argued that a sharp defeat inflicted on American and British forces could generate political consequences, weaken coalition unity, and compel a re-evaluation of strategic priorities. Within this framework, a counteroffensive was envisioned not merely as an operational maneuver, but as a political instrument intended to influence the course of the conflict. By late September 1944, staff officers began drafting studies evaluating possible axes of attack. These studies were rooted in earlier experiences from 1940, when the Ardennes had served as a corridor for rapid German maneuver, though the situation in 1944 was markedly different. The terrain remained densely forested and difficult to traverse, but it also offered concealment for troop movements. Road networks were limited and often narrow, complicating the passage of armored formations. Yet these constraints were weighed against the potential benefit of attacking through a sector where the Allies did not anticipate major operations. As planning advanced, the Ardennes gradually narrowed to become the preferred site for a large-scale offensive. Intelligence assessments indicated that the American presence in the region consisted largely of units recovering from earlier combat or integrating replacements. These units held extended sectors with limited depth, relying heavily on road communications for reinforcement. German analysts judged that a sudden, concentrated breakthrough could disrupt these lines before Allied commanders had time to react. Additionally, the terrain itself restricted the Allies' ability to reposition mechanized units rapidly, providing German forces with a brief window to advance toward operational objectives. The intended scope of the operation expanded as political leadership pressed for an ambitious plan. Early proposals suggested a limited offensive aimed at halting Allied progress or securing more defensible terrain. However, the preference from the highest level was for an attack with the potential to split the Allied front and reach the port of Antwerp. Achieving such a breakthrough would require mobilizing several armored divisions, supported by infantry corps and supplemented by reserve formations. This expansion reflected a belief that only a large-scale success could meaningfully alter the war's strategic direction. The question of resources became central to the developing plan. Fuel shortages posed a significant obstacle. German armored divisions required large quantities of fuel to conduct both the initial breakthrough and the exploitation phase. Staff calculations attempted to estimate the minimum fuel needed to reach the Meuse River crossings and beyond. These estimates influenced decisions regarding which units would participate and what supply priorities they would receive. In parallel, ammunition stocks were assessed for artillery, infantry weapons, and tank guns. The requirement for massed fire support at critical points of the attack demanded careful allocation. Despite these limitations, the plan continued to take form under the assumption that rapid success would alleviate supply concerns. If German forces could achieve a breakthrough within the first several days, it was believed that captured Allied depots might supplement depleted reserves. This assumption carried significant risk, as it depended on both maneuver success and the availability of usable supplies in captured areas. Nonetheless, it aligned with the argument that Germany needed a bold initiative rather than a conservative defense. Planning documents from October and November show a growing consensus among senior staff that the offensive offered a narrow but real opportunity. These documents emphasized the importance of secrecy. Preparations were to be concealed through restricted communications, night movements, and misleading operational signals. Divisions slated to participate in the offensive were withdrawn under various pretexts and sent to refit areas where they could be re-equipped for the operation. Training priorities shifted toward offensive maneuvers, bridge seizures, and rapid exploitation. The formulation of the final plan reflected the convergence of military necessity and political expectation. It called for a concentrated assault in the Ardennes, aiming for a rapid advance toward key river crossings and ultimately the port of Antwerp. The plan envisioned disruptions to Allied command structure, logistical networks, and operational cohesion. Even if the offensive did not achieve its most ambitious goals, senior leadership believed it could delay Allied advances, create opportunities on other fronts, and strengthen Germany's bargaining position. By early December, the preparatory phase was nearing completion. Units designated for the offensive had assembled in concealed positions. Artillery batteries were distributed along the front, calibrated for pre-planned fire missions. Armored divisions completed final maintenance on vehicles, despite shortages of spare parts. Infantry regiments underwent last-minute integration of replacements and received winter equipment where available. All of these measures occurred under strict operational secrecy, with radio silence maintained to avoid detection by Allied intercept stations. The origins of the Ardennes Plan thus emerged from a complex mixture of strategic calculation, resource constraints, and political determination. It represented an effort to transform a deteriorating military situation into a moment of potential opportunity. German leadership recognized the risks, yet judged that the alternative, continued attrition across multiple fronts, would produce an outcome even less favorable. As the final weeks of preparation unfolded, commanders along the Western Front understood that the offensive would demand precise execution under difficult conditions. The decision to proceed reflected both the urgency of the moment and the belief that only decisive action could alter the course of the war. The Ardennes Offensive was conceived as a deliberate attempt to create a strategic shock at a moment when most assessments pointed toward the gradual but inevitable collapse of German military capacity. The leadership recognized that the Allies had come to regard the Western Front as stable enough to support continued logistics buildup and long-term planning. This assumption rested on the observable deterioration of German divisions, the strain on their transportation networks, and the cumulative impact of months of defensive withdrawals. Yet the very predictability of German weakness formed the basis for the intended shock. By attacking where Allied confidence was strongest, the German command sought to exploit the element of surprise in both tactical execution and strategic perception. German planners understood that the Western Allies did not expect a major offensive in late 1944. Intelligence intercepts, reconnaissance observations, and prisoner interrogations all suggested that Allied analysis viewed German forces in the Ardennes sector as depleted and unfit for large-scale operations. The logistical patterns of German units, limited fuel movement, reduced ammunition consumption, and restricted motorized transport were interpreted as signs of exhaustion rather than deliberate concealment. Allied air dominance reinforced this perception by limiting visible German activity during daylight hours, making it difficult to detect troop concentrations or supply movements. Against this backdrop, the German plan aimed to create a rupture in the Allied line that would force a re-evaluation of the entire strategic situation. The shock was intended to unfold in several layers. At the tactical level, American divisions deployed for holding operations would encounter a sudden and unexpected massed assault supported by armor, artillery, and specialized infiltration units. At the operational level, the rapid penetration toward key river crossings would challenge Allied command structures, requiring them to redirect reserves and reconsider the integrity of their front. At the strategic level, the German leadership sought to undermine the cohesion of the Allied coalition by demonstrating that its advance could still be halted and possibly reversed through decisive action. The ambition of the plan reflected this layered approach. The offensive did not merely seek to inflict casualties or delay Allied progress. Rather, it intended to impose a psychological and political effect that would extend beyond the battlefield. German assessments noted that the Allied coalition relied heavily on synchronized planning, shared logistics, and continuous cooperation between American and British commands. A significant disruption in the Ardennes might strain this cooperation by introducing divergent priorities and operational disagreements. The German leadership believed that even a partial success could have consequences disproportionate to the resources expended. This calculation was shaped by precedents earlier in the war. German commanders recalled the impact of the early campaigns in 1940 and 1941, when rapid, concentrated offensives in unexpected sectors produced outcomes that far exceeded their initial tactical scope. The memory of these earlier operations influenced the belief that a well-planned attack could still achieve decisive results, despite the unfavorable strategic environment. Although the conditions of late 1944 were dramatically different, marked by shortages, attrition, and the erosion of German air power, the conceptual framework of sudden, localized concentration remained central to the operation's design. The intended shock also rested on an assessment of Allied operational behavior. German intelligence noted that American units in particular relied heavily on logistical predictability and large-scale support systems. These systems enabled sustained operations, but also created vulnerabilities if disrupted. The German plan sought to exploit this by targeting transportation routes, command posts, and key junctions. If successfully executed, these disruptions would complicate Allied reinforcement efforts and reduce their ability to coordinate countermeasures. Moreover, German planners believed that the terrain favored their movement in the initial stages, as the dense forests and limited road networks would hinder rapid Allied response. The strategic shock extended to the timing of the offensive. The choice of launching the attack in December carried multiple implications. The harsh winter weather was expected to limit Allied air operations, reducing the effectiveness of reconnaissance and interdiction sorties. This would allow German armored formations to advance with reduced exposure to air attack, a critical factor given the imbalance in air power. Additionally, the timing coincided with the holiday period, when some Allied units were believed to anticipate reduced activity. German planners hoped that the initial days of the offensive would achieve maximum effect before Allied commanders could fully assess the situation and mobilize reserves. In preparing for the offensive, the German command worked to reinforce the impression of defensive posture. Movements of reserves and supplies were conducted primarily at night. Radio silence was enforced across participating units. Deceptive measures were introduced to mislead Allied intelligence regarding the location and readiness of armored divisions. These measures were part of a broader effort to conceal the scale of the operation, ensuring that the strategic shock would not be blunted by premature detection. Despite these efforts, internal assessments acknowledged substantial risks. The success of the operation depended on achieving rapid breakthroughs in the early hours, securing key road networks, and maintaining momentum despite fuel shortages. Any significant delay could allow the Allies to regroup, exploit their logistical superiority, and counterattack before German forces reached critical objectives. The leadership recognized that failure might accelerate the deterioration of the German position, leaving them with diminished reserves and widened gaps in their defensive lines. Yet these risks were considered acceptable in light of the broader strategic picture. Without a decisive action, the prospects for stabilizing the Western Front were increasingly remote. The expected shock also carried a political dimension. The leadership believed that a dramatic reversal of fortunes on the Western Front might influence ongoing Allied domestic debates. In Britain, the strain of prolonged war had intensified pressure on leadership. In the United States, the anticipation of eventual victory was already shaping discussions about post-war planning. A sudden setback could introduce uncertainty into these deliberations and potentially influence public sentiment. Although speculative, these considerations formed part of the rationale for undertaking an operation of such scale. The intended shock thus reflected not only military aspirations, but also an attempt to reshape perceptions. German planners sought to demonstrate that the Wehrmacht retained the capacity to mount coordinated large-scale operations despite deteriorating conditions. This demonstration was aimed at both external and internal audiences. Within Germany, morale had been affected by months of retreat and the disruption of daily life through air raids and shortages. A successful offensive offered the possibility of bolstering public confidence and reinforcing the belief that the war could still be influenced by decisive action. As the final preparations were completed, the concept of strategic shock took on a tangible form. Armored divisions assembled in the forest clearings. Artillery batteries positioned themselves for the opening barrage. Infantry units reviewed routes of advance and objectives. Despite the constraints imposed by shortages and the cumulative effects of prolonged combat, the German leadership believed that the combination of surprise, terrain, and concentration offered a credible chance of achieving a shock that might alter the course of the conflict. The plan's logic rested on the assumption that the Allies, having become accustomed to German defensive behavior, would not anticipate a major offensive. The expected surprise, coupled with the operational vulnerabilities of the Ardennes sector, formed the core of the German strategy. Whether the shock would achieve its intended effect remained uncertain, but the leadership deemed it the most viable option available in a situation defined by diminishing alternatives. The documentary record behind the Ardennes Offensive reveals a systematic process shaped by military necessity, constrained resources, and the political expectations of the German leadership. The files that survive, operational orders, staff memoranda, intelligence summaries, and logistical assessments, form a detailed, though incomplete, account of how the offensive took shape. These documents reflect the pressures of late 1944, a campaign planned under conditions of scarcity, undertaken with limited reliable intelligence, and executed in an environment where strategic urgency overshadowed material limitations. Among the most significant surviving documents are the staff papers produced by Army Group B and the 6th Panzer Army. These papers outline the preliminary stages of the offensive, including route studies, force composition charts, and evaluations of required support assets. The documents emphasize the need for concentrated force at the breakthrough points, specifying the allocation of armored divisions and detailing the construction of engineer bridges for anticipated river crossings. They also address the risks associated with the limited road network in the Ardennes, warning that bottlenecks could delay the advance and expose units to counterattack. These assessments were entered into internal planning logs, often annotated by senior officers who questioned whether the designated routes could sustain the traffic expected in the opening days. Reconnaissance reports constitute another key element of the documentary record. German patrols, aided by experienced guides familiar with the terrain, gathered information on American positions, road conditions, and obstacles. Although limited by Allied air presence and winter weather, these reports provided valuable insights into the disposition of American forces. Analysts compiled the findings into intelligence summaries that highlighted weaknesses in the American line, particularly in sectors held by divisions recently introduced to the front. These summaries noted sparse defensive depth, reliance on road-bound supply lines, and limited armored reserves positioned immediately behind the front. The intelligence assessments formed the basis for identifying the initial assault sectors, where German commanders believed momentum could be achieved rapidly. Communication intercepts also played a role in shaping the offensive plan. German signals intelligence units monitored Allied radio traffic, although their ability to decrypt messages had diminished significantly by late 1944. Nonetheless, intercepted messages revealed patterns in American supply movements and command rotations. While the content lacked detailed operational intelligence, it reinforced the perception that the Ardennes sector remained a quiet area where the Americans did not expect significant activity. These observations were incorporated into broader intelligence evaluations, submitted to higher headquarters, supporting the argument that the sector offered an opportunity for surprise. Logistical forecasts represent one of the most revealing components of the surviving documentation. Fuel estimates in particular demonstrate the precarious nature of the offensive. Staff officers calculated the minimum fuel needed for armored divisions to reach the Meuse River, basing their projections on ideal conditions and uninterrupted momentum. These projections were cross-referenced with available fuel reserves stored in depots behind the front. The resulting figures showed a narrow margin, acknowledging that any deviation from the planned timetable could jeopardize the operation. Ammunition forecasts, although somewhat more favorable, also reflected stringent limitations. The documents note that artillery units would need to ration shells, especially during the second and third days of the advance, unless additional supplies could be captured from American depots. Another set of documents concerns the redeployment and reorganization of German units. Orders issued in late November instructed specific divisions to withdraw from the front under various justifications, including refitting, training cycles, or reassignment to quieter sectors. These orders were designed to mask the concentration of forces for the offensive. Unit diaries record the arrival of replacement personnel, though often in insufficient numbers to restore divisions to full strength. Maintenance logs document urgent efforts to repair tanks and vehicles, despite shortages of spare parts. These records underscore the complexity of assembling a force capable of executing a major offensive under conditions of sustained attrition. The internal correspondence between senior commanders reveals differing interpretations of the offensive's feasibility. Some expressed confidence that a rapid breakthrough could be achieved, citing earlier successes in forested terrain. Others warned that the limited road network and expected congestion could hinder the advance. These concerns were conveyed in memoranda that questioned whether the planned timetable was realistic, especially given the expected winter weather and the unpredictability of Allied reactions. The documents showed that such reservations were acknowledged but ultimately overridden by the insistence on achieving a decisive result. Engineers played a crucial role in the planning process, and their reports form an essential part of the archival record. Engineer assessments outlined the need to clear roads, fortify bridges, and construct additional routes to support the movement of armored divisions. They also analyzed river crossings, identifying points where temporary bridges could be built quickly. Winter conditions required engineers to plan for the possibility of ice accumulation on roads, which could slow vehicle movement. Their reports included detailed diagrams of forest paths, elevation profiles, and the structural condition of bridges. These assessments were integrated into the broader operational plan, although limitations in time and resources prevented full implementation of all recommended measures. Artillery command reports contributed to shaping the fire plan for the opening barrage. These reports specified the number of available guns, shell quantities, and priority targets. The artillery plan emphasized concentrated fire on American positions identified as weak points, particularly command posts, communication centers, and road junctions. The reports warned that prolonged preparatory bombardments would be impossible due to ammunition shortages. Instead, artillery units were instructed to fire brief but intense barrages immediately before the infantry assault, relying on surprise to compensate for limited volume. The leadership's emphasis on secrecy is evident throughout the documentary record. Directives requiring radio silence, restricted communications, and controlled movement were issued repeatedly. These measures were intended to prevent Allied intelligence from detecting the concentration of German forces. Records show that orders were conveyed through couriers when possible, avoiding radio transmissions that might reveal troop movements. Secrecy extended to the highest echelons, with key details of the plan withheld from many field commanders until the final days before the offensive. This compartmentalization reduced the risk of leaks, but created challenges in preparing units for coordinated action. The surviving documents also include contingency plans for the opening days of the offensive. These plans address the possibility of encountering stronger than expected resistance, delays caused by weather, or unexpected logistical disruptions. Contingency directives instructed units to adjust their axes of advance, exploit local successes, or reinforce neighboring formations if necessary. While these measures reflected careful planning, they also revealed the limits of German flexibility. The offensive was heavily dependent on maintaining momentum, and any significant deviation from the timetable threatened to compromise its overall objectives. What emerges from the documentary record is a detailed but constrained process. The planning for the Ardennes Offensive relied on careful analysis of terrain, intelligence assessments of Allied dispositions, and an understanding of Germany's remaining operational capabilities. Yet it was shaped equally by shortages, time pressure, and political demands. The documents show a command structure aware of the risks, but committed to the belief that a decisive action could create a strategic shock capable of influencing the war's outcome. The archival material thus provides a window into both the ambition and the limitations that defined the German approach to one of the final major offensives of the conflict. By early December 1944, the German leadership had moved beyond preliminary planning and entered the decisive phase of preparing for the offensive. The commitment to what would become the Ardennes assault was not the product of a single directive, but rather a cumulative series of decisions, each narrowing alternatives and increasing dependence on a bold outcome. The strategic situation offered few options. Defensive operations along the Western Front consumed resources at an unsustainable rate, and the ongoing pressures in the east demanded reinforcements Germany could no longer